The rent went up again. Not by much, just enough to notice. The hospital bill looks higher than expected, even after insurance. And the job feels less stable than it did a few years ago, though no one has said anything out loud. Each of these moments feels separate, unrelated, ordinary, but they're not. Behind them is a financial system most people never see. One that doesn't advertise, doesn't sell products, and almost never shows up in everyday conversation. Yet it quietly shapes where you live, how you're treated when you're sick, and what happens when companies decide to cut costs. That system is called private equity. Private equity doesn't feel like power. It doesn't look like Silicon Valley. It doesn't speak in slogans. It doesn't campaign or trend or go viral. Most of the time, it's invisible. Private equity firms buy companies. They restructure them, and eventually, they sell them. All of this happens legally, methodically, often without the public noticing at all. Today, private equity firms control more than $8 trillion globally. They own hospitals, apartment buildings, nursing homes, retail chains, logistics networks. Not directly, in ways most people recognize, but enough to shape everyday life from behind the scenes. Start with housing. For decades, home ownership in the United States followed a familiar pattern. Families bought homes. They stayed. They built equity over time. Then came the financial crisis in 2008. Millions of homes were foreclosed. Prices collapsed. Entire neighborhoods changed hands. That's when institutional investors stepped in. Firms like Blackstone began buying single-family homes at scale, not one or two at a time, but thousands. Sometimes entire streets in cities like Phoenix, Atlanta, and Tampa. Blackstone eventually spun many of these properties into a company called Invitation Homes, now one of the largest landlords of single-family houses in the country. The model wasn't built around community. It was built around efficiency, centralized maintenance, standardized fees, algorithmic rent pricing that adjusted faster than human landlords ever could. For renters, it often meant higher rents, less flexibility, and a landlord who existed mostly through a portal. Housing didn't just become expensive, it became financialized. Blackstone is only one name. There's KKR, Brookfield, Carlyle Group, Bain Capital. Together, these firms manage more money than the annual economic output of most countries. They don't operate like traditional companies. They operate as owners of owners. They buy businesses, install new management, restructure operations, and move on. Their influence isn't concentrated in one industry. It's spread across the economy. And that's what makes it difficult to see and easy to underestimate. At its core, private equity follows a simple sequence. First, a firm buys a company, but usually not with its own cash. Instead, it uses borrowed money. The debt isn't held by the private equity firm. It's placed onto the company being acquired. Then come the changes. Costs are reduced. Staffing levels are reassessed. Assets are sold. Operations are streamlined. Along the way, management fees are collected. Sometimes dividends are paid out. Finally comes the exit. The company is sold, or taken public, or passed to another owner. If the deal succeeds, returns can be enormous. If it fails, the company, and often its workers, absorb most of the damage. This structure is legal, it's common, and it's deeply embedded in modern finance. Private equity didn't grow by accident. First, there was cheap money. For more than a decade after the financial crisis, interest rates stayed historically low. Debt was easy to raise. Leverage became attractive. Second, there were pensions, public retirement funds for teachers, firefighters, city workers. Needed returns high enough to meet long-term promises. Private equity offered them. And third, there were regulatory gaps. Private equity firms operate with far less disclosure than public companies. Fewer reporting requirements, less public scrutiny. Together, these forces made private equity not just viable, but dominant. Once it worked in one sector, it moved quickly into others. Healthcare is one of the clearest examples. In many U.S. hospitals, emergency room doctors aren't employed by the hospital itself. They're employed by staffing firms. Companies like Team Health. Team Health was acquired by Blackstone in 2016. Another firm, Envision Healthcare, was acquired by KKR. These companies manage tens of thousands of doctors across hundreds of hospitals. Patients didn't choose them. Hospitals didn't fully control them. Yet they handled billing, This structure helped fuel the rise of surprise medical bills, especially out-of-network charges that patients had little ability to avoid. For people arriving in an emergency room, the experience felt arbitrary, confusing, and unavoidable. Behind it was a system optimized for revenue, not simplicity. Retail tells a different story. In 2005, Bain Capital, KKR, and Vornado Realty Trust acquired Toys R Us in a leveraged buyout. The company took on billions of dollars in debt, money that could have gone into e-commerce, into store upgrades, into competing with Amazon. Instead, it went towards servicing interest payments. Over time, margins shrank, stores aged, competition intensified. In 2017, Toys R Us filed for bankruptcy. Roughly 33,000 jobs were lost in the US alone. The demand for toys never disappeared. The ownership structure made survival harder. In elder care, the effects are quieter, but the stakes are higher. Carlyle Group acquired Manor Care, one of the largest nursing home operators in the United States. The real estate was separated from operations. Facilities were sold and leased back. Costs were reduced. Staffing levels changed. Over time, complaints increased. Quality ratings declined. Legal scrutiny followed. Again, this wasn't illegal. It was financial optimization applied to long-term care. Across industries, similar patterns appear. After acquisitions, layoffs are common. Wages often stagnate. Benefits are reassessed. Not always, but often enough to show up in data. Research has found higher job turnover at private equity-owned firms compared to similar businesses. For investors, flexibility is a feature. For workers, it can feel like instability. On their own, these stories seem disconnected. A rent increase here, a medical bill there, a store closing somewhere else. But together, they form a pattern. Private equity doesn't invent problems. It amplifies existing pressures. Housing becomes an asset class. Healthcare becomes a revenue stream. Jobs become cost centers. For people inside these systems, the experience often feels distant and impersonal, shaped by decisions made far away. Yes, private equity operates squarely within the law. Carried interest is taxed as capital gains. Disclosure requirements are limited. Oversight is fragmented. Regulators usually respond after problems become visible. The system isn't malfunctioning. It's functioning as designed. Private equity firms argue their role is misunderstood. They say they revive struggling companies, improve efficiency, and provide capital where traditional investors won't. Sometimes that's true. There are cases where private equity stabilizes businesses and keeps them alive. The tension isn't about intent. It's about incentives. Here's the part most people don't realize. Much of the money fueling private equity comes from ordinary people. Public pensions, university endowments, retirement funds, teachers' savings helped by rental homes. Firefighters' pensions help fund hospital acquisitions. The same people affected by rising costs are often indirectly invested in the system producing them, not by choice, by design. Private equity isn't slowing down. It's moving into infrastructure, data centers, energy systems, water utilities, logistics networks, assets that feel public, essential, permanent. As governments struggle with debt and aging infrastructure, private capital fills the gap, quietly. Private equity doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It works through contracts, balance sheets, and ownership structures most people never see. Yet its influence is everywhere. In where you live, where you work, and how systems behave when they're under pressure. Not as a villain, not as a savior, but as a system doing exactly what it was built to do. The question isn't whether private equity is good or bad. It's whether a system designed for returns should shape so much of everyday life without most people ever noticing.